All right, and now for our afternoon talk. Our speaker today is Kimberly Lau. Kim is a professor of literature at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She's one of my most beloved colleagues. And she teaches courses on fairy tales, monster studies, popular culture, 20th and 21st century women's fiction. She invented our department's Vampires in Literature and Popular Culture class, which I now share with her, and so I'm very grateful for her for conceiving that class. And she situates all of these classes within the context of feminist theory, critical race studies, and gender and sexuality studies. She's the author of numerous books and articles on similar topics. Her most recent book is called Spectres of the Marvelous: Race and the Development of the European Fairy Tale, which came out last year, and I had a very good time reading through all of the blurbs for that book because they're really wonderful, but I'm just going to highlight one, that it's been described as, quote, literary litigation at its finest, as it, quote, thoroughly debunks the unmarked, naturalized, inevitable whiteness of the European fairy tales that we were raised with. Kim's other books include Erotic Infidelities, Love and Desire in Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber, which I always use whenever I'm teaching that book, Body Language, Sisters in Shape, Black Women's Fitness and Feminist Identity Politics, and her first book was New Age Capitalism, Making Money East of Eden. Kim is really, as I said, one of my absolute favorite colleagues in the literature department. She's somebody that I learned so much from, that I talk to about teaching, about research, life in general. She's somebody who shares my intense love of close reading, and somebody who is incredibly fun and incredibly provocative to think with. Her talk today is called Monsters, A Reckoning. So please join me in giving Kim a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. I've never had such a lovely introduction before. Can you hear me? This feels a little high. Okay. Monsters are everywhere around us, and they're definitely the cool kids. Edgy, hip, darkly attractive. We want to be near them. We want to be them. Even the less hipster monsters draw us to them with their cuddly affability, their grouchy repartee, and their endearingly clumsy attempts at human convention. Endowed with names and backstories, the often nameless villains of our childhood stories have become sympathetic protagonists, if not heroes, as accounts of their earlier bullying, abuse, and trauma provide the motivations for their monstrosity. Similarly, those whose familiar names, Lucifer, Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, once conjured torture and eternal damnation, carried warnings about outsiders, and reinforced cultural boundaries, have since become alluring central figures, eliciting our understanding, compassion, not to mention desire. Of course, narrating from the monster's perspective is not especially new. Jeffrey Weinstock suggests that John Gardner's 1971 retelling of Beowulf from Grendel's perspective initiates this trend. We might go even further back to Mary Shelley's 1818 Frankenstein as a novel driven by the monster's feelings. Nonetheless, the breadth and popularity of the cool kid, sympathetic, captivating monster seem to be a product of our extended cultural moment. In the Academy, Michel Foucault's 1975 Collège de France lectures on abnormality, in which he invokes the monster, or three versions of the monster to be more precise, to illustrate the cultural production of abnormality and its distinction from normality, are a commonly cited point of origin for the contemporary study of monsters. More paradigmatic, of course, is Jeffrey Jerome Cohen's 1996 essay, Monster Theory, 7 Theses, widely understood as consolidating multidisciplinary approaches to studying the monster into the field of monster studies. Outside of the academy, identitarian social movements, civil rights, feminism, LGBTQ+, for example, have likewise contributed to the repositioning of the monster, so typically instantiations of the marginalized and the oppressed, as not only sympathetic but attractive, whether for their resistance to and subversion of dominant culture, for the ways they model other non-hegemonic ways of being, or for the opportunities they provide for personal identification and self-making. Needless to say, the inside-outside boundary I just articulated is a false one, as social movements, identitarian politics, and the related popular, commercial, literary, filmic, and graphic proliferation of monsters obviously inspire scholarship about such figures, and vice versa. We see this convergence and collaboration in the wealth of anthologies, special issues, monographs, books, conferences, symposia, and panels devoted to monsters and monster studies. For example, just this week, in the call for submissions section of the American Folklore Society newsletter, included the 2026 Gods and Monsters Conference, a special issue of the Journal of Folklore and Education devoted to, quote, teaching with monsters, and the 31st annual Delta Symposium, whose theme is monsters, cryptids, and the monstrous. And all of those are still open calls, by the way, so if you're interested in applying to them, get in touch with me and I can forward the newsletter to you. And of course, our own Festival of Monsters offers an early and excellent example. The programs from the past several years highlight research on monsters in historical and contemporary literary texts and films, in video games and on stage, and in social media, memes, and music, all grounded in critical theories of race, sexuality, gender, and disability, as well as psychoanalytic and post-colonial theory, genre studies, popular culture, and visual culture studies. Monster studies is clearly a rich and expansive field. Indeed, so far as I can tell, there's only one dimension of monsters missing from the field, and that's fear. That is to say, in calling attention to what Jack Halberstam calls technologies of monstrosity, in focusing on the ideological mechanisms and machinations by which monsters are produced, in detailing the oppressions implicit in such processes, in contributing to and consuming the proliferation of sympathetic, cool, desirable monsters of our current moment, we, by which I mean all of us as scholars, as well as all of us as part of everyday popular and consumer culture, have evacuated fear from the monster. This, then, is the reckoning of my title. But why, we might ask, should we care about fear? Apart from its role as a basic survival mechanism, the biological, physiological, neurological aspects of fear, fear probably doesn't seem like an emotion or an affect whose loss should concern us. After all, fear has long been a means of control and domination, something Machiavelli understood and advised as early as the 15th century, and that Hobbes reiterated in slightly different fashion roughly a century later. Lars Svensson, in his book, A Philosophy of Fear, offers a succinct summary of the commonalities in their conceptualizations of fear and power. Quote, both philosophers agree that whoever controls fear in a society is well on the way to controlling the entire society. In both of them, it is fear of violence that forms the basis of human solidarity. While such bald uses of fear to control society may not be as clearly articulated today, the underlying principles still pertain, particularly in the aftermath of 9/11, as many political and cultural critics note. Svensson, for instance, identifies fear society as the very inspiration for his book, writing in the preface that, quote, "This book is a result of my increasing irritation at the colonization of our life world by fear. It is an attack on the tendency to consider practically all phenomena from a perspective of fear. A paradoxical trait of the culture of fear is that it emerges at a time when, by all accounts, we are living more securely than ever before in human history," end quote. Svensson's sense that fear has colonized the entirety of our life world resonates with Sarah Ahmed's claim that, quote, "Fear works to secure truth precisely through the narration of crisis or insecurity," end quote, and to, quote, "make truths is to make worlds." In this context, Ahmed contends that, quote, "Fear works to produce subjects in relation to others and to secure the very boundaries that become lived as givens. As such, the boundary or border becomes a site of fear and anxiety, and Ahmed argues that, quote, "This is why the politics of fear is narrated as a border anxiety. Fear speaks the language of floods and swamps, of being invaded by inappropriate others against whom the nation must defend itself. To invoke the language of floods and swamps, of invasion, is to animate the etymology of monster, which, according to Timothy Beale, derives from the Latin monstrum, which is related to the verb monstrare, show or reveal, and monere, warn or portend. The process by which Ahmed's cultural affective analysis of fear necessarily conjures the monster reverberates in a point Brian Masumi makes in his article, Fear, the Spectrum Said, about the color-coded warning system introduced in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. He writes, "However many times fear is contained, it will always also exceed the containment because its capacity to self-regenerate will continue to loom, and that looming will define the surrounding mood." As in Ahmed's description of fear, Masumi's characterization of fear as exceeding containment, as capable of self-regeneration, as ever present in its looming, recalls the monster. Fear, it appears, is not only an oppressive and othering apparatus of social control, but also one that implicitly and invisibly relies on the language of the monster and the monster as language, that is, the revelation, the warning, in order to do so. I thus return to my original question about fear. Why should we care about it when it seems to be working at cross purposes to our own? Following Susan McManus, I want to suggest that fear matters because of its affective relationship to hope and to the possibility of what McManus calls, quote, "potentially transformative agency and agential capacity." Fear and hope have, of course, long been interlinked. Aristotle, for instance, assumes that fear is always connected to hope because without hope of a solution, a way out, there is no point to fear. That is, if all hope is lost, so too is all fear. Thomas Aquinas makes a similar point when he claims that those who are eternally damned cannot know fear since they have been condemned to a fully hopeless state. Neither McManus nor I are compelled by this interrelationship of fear and hope, however. Rather, I want to think with McManus about how feelings of ambivalence have the potential to, quote, "interrupt an affective politics in which hope is presumed to shape subversive agency while fear renders subjects complicit and governable." Affective ambivalence emphasizes room for a gentle maneuver, the possibility of, and now here McManus is citing Anne Savekovich, quote, depathologizing negative affects so that they can be seen as a possible resource for political action rather than its antithesis, end quote. Here, it's also important to recall that Savekovich's project is to conceive of negative affects, and depression in particular, as a public feeling, not an individualized one. For Savekovich, it's imperative that we avoid making a, quote, simple distinction between good and bad feelings, or assume that good politics can only emerge from good feelings. Feeling bad might, in fact, be the ground for transformation, end quote. Highly attuned to the fact that fear is a, quote, predominant affective formation in the political present, end quote, McManus then explores the question of how hope and fear can be, quote, oriented together, suggesting that to do so might make possible what she calls a gentle capacity. The real crux, of course, is how to go about restructuring or depathologizing, I don't know, I can't say that today, depathologizing fear in a way that sutures it to hope. One possibility for McManus entails a subversion and reappropriation of dominant technologies of fear. She writes, quote, one way of restructuring fear affect, then, is by intervening in the feedback loops through which fear is stabilized. This might involve turning the technologies that are central to the production of fear against themselves. When protesters use surveillance technologies against police, for instance, the feedback loops that those technologies sustain are interrupted, and the hegemonies they secure are disrupted, rendered capricious, variable, and open to intervention, end quote. It is with the possibility of restructuring fear affect as a way of imagining hope affect and perhaps the potential for transformative politics that I turn to my final section, toward a theory of monstrosity, 5.5 theses, an explicit summoning of Cohen's seminal monster theory, 7 theses. When I first began thinking about how the successes of monster studies and the rise of the sympathetic monster have evacuated the monster's capacity to instill fear, I thought we needed to re-theorize monster studies with white heteromasculinity at its center, since the only truly frightening monsters I could think of were all reifications of white heteromasculinity. But as we know, the monster is simply the materialization of monstrosity. That is, the monster emerges from technologies of fear, a sign, a revelation, a warning. More than an obvious riff on Cohen's foundational essay, then, my effort to theorize monstrosity seeks to complement his monster theory, relying on a similar methodology and hopefully offering a productive distinction between theories of the monster and theories of monstrosity. Like Cohen, I draw from transhistorical and transcultural and by transcultural in my case I mean trans-Western cultural. I draw from transhistorical and transcultural cases and contexts to propose a speculative and again channeling Cohen, a breakable theory of monstrosity. Where Cohen offers examples from a range of historical and cultural cases, however, I focus specifically on the monstrosity of our contemporary moment, white, heteropatriarchal masculinism, as expressed in the manosphere and manosphere-adjacent phenomena. To be clear, because you might not think I'm actually saying this, to be clear, I am arguing that monstrosity is always a manifestation of white heteropatriarchal masculinism. The manosphere and its related cultural phenomena are thus not the monstrosity of the moment among other possible monstrosities, but rather this moment's specific iteration of monstrous white heteropatriarchal masculinism. Before moving on to my 5.5 theses, I want to define and describe very briefly the manosphere and manosphere-adjacent phenomenon. Some of you are probably already well aware of the manosphere. For those of you lucky enough to have no clue what I'm referring to, I apologize for what I'm about to introduce you to. First popularized by Ian Ironwood, a porn marketer and the author of the self-published 2013 book, The Manosphere, A New Hope for Masculinity. The manosphere refers to a loose set of virulently misogynistic online communities. Justin Horowitz, in a 2023 briefing compiled for the nonprofit Media Matters for America, describes the manosphere as, quote, an online community of right-wing websites, bloggers, and influencers that is cultivating a worldview based on a conservative and outdated gender politics that valorizes pickup artists, violent misogynists, incels, men's rights advocates, and conservative cultural critics. The group often blames women for myriad societal woes and treats them as an inferior sex, end quote. Simon James Copland elaborates on this woman blaming in his 2025 book, The Male Complaint, The Manosphere and Misogyny Online, which I read. It took me a very long time because I could only read a chapter a day in this book. So Copland elaborates on this woman blaming, characterizing manosphere groups as constituted by those who, quote, believe that feminism and women more broadly have destroyed not just their lives, but politics, the economy, and society, end quote. Alice E. Marwick and Robin Kaplan, in their 2018 article titled Drinking Male Tears, Language, the Manosphere, and Networked Harassment, echo these points while also highlighting manosphere men's perceived need to combat feminism and the supposedly misandrist culture they believe it has created. In their analysis of online sexual harassment in the manosphere, they note that its participants, quote, share a central belief that feminine values dominate society, that this fact is suppressed by feminist and political correctness, and that men must fight back against an overarching misandrist culture to protect their very existence, end quote. While such groups may seem like fringe elements of society espousing laughable beliefs and thus not worthy of serious concern, it turns out that the manosphere is, in fact, entirely mainstream and growing in its influence. To quote the title of Rachel Louise Snyder's March 2025 guest essay in the New York Times, we underestimate the manosphere at our peril. At the center of Snyder's essay is a study conducted by researchers at Dublin City University that identified a, quote, surge of male supremacy videos in young men's social media feeds. Rightfully alarmed by this uptake in male supremacy videos, the researchers created fake TikTok and YouTube accounts ostensibly registered to teen boys in order to see how quickly misogynistic videos appeared in their feeds, often the results of searches including terms as benign as gaming and gym tips. It took less than 9 minutes for what they called troubling content to appear. Much of this content, quote, blamed women and trans people for the standing they believe men have lost in the world, end quote. Within 23 minutes, much more extreme content appeared, including explicitly anti-feminist and anti-LGBTQ videos that combined male supremacy with, quote, reactionary right-wing punditry appeared within 2 to 3 hours. As Snyder notes, quote, many manosphere accounts openly call for women to be subjugated and subordinate to men, end quote. And she offers a few examples from Andrew Tate, widely considered the top manosphere influencer. According to Snyder, Tate has, quote, publicly stated that if a girlfriend doesn't accept cheating, quote, that's when you start hitting her and being abusive. He also claims that, quote, he will choose a husband for any daughter he has, and she'll end up pregnant at 21 like she's supposed to be, adding that, quote, I don't think that young women should be making their own choices about who their lifelong partners are, end quote. Again, these may seem like fringe ideas shared among a small subset of Western society, but Andrew Tate alone has about 10 million followers on the platform X, and hashtag Tate videos on TikTok have been viewed over 13 billion times, despite the fact that Tate was banned from the platform in 2023. So I think this is enough of the manosphere to give you a sense of what it entails. I'll be referring to more specifics as I lay out my 5.5 theses, but if there's one takeaway here, it's that we should be afraid, very, very afraid. Thesis 1, monstrosity is ideological. That monstrosity is ideological may seem self-evident, and yet we tend to individualize the monsters that animate it. Andrew Tate, Julian Blanc, Jordan Peterson, Nick Fuentes, Myron Gaines, and Walter Weeks, Sneeko, Rushvi, etc. Unrelated to the manosphere, Claire Dederer catalogs a list of individual monsters that anchors her 2023 book, Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma, in which she explores the question, quote, what ought we to do with great art made by bad men? A question first piqued by her troubled critical relationship to Roman Polanski. How, she wonders, should a critic navigate the tension between the, quote, absoluteness of monstrosity and the absoluteness of genius, end quote. The tension in Romansky's case between his brilliance as a filmmaker and his monstrosity as a child rapist. Over the course of Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma, Dederer also considers Woody Allen, Michael Jackson, David Bowie, Pablo Picasso, Ernest Hemingway, Richard Wagner, Carl Andre, and in a variation on her question of what we ought to do with great art made by bad men, J.K. Rowling, Virginia Woolf, and Willa Cather. Ironically, though, Dederer's very act of producing a book to meditate on these individual monsters, most of whom are given their own chapters, diminishes their individualism and situates them within patriarchal and racist ideological systems. That is, Dederer's collection of individual genius monsters underscores not so much the complexities of the great artists who have done monstrous things as the continuities among them, the systems, cultural, political, mediated, institutional, of which they are a part. If monstrosity is ideological, the impulse to individualize the monster makes good sense, however. In so doing, we might imagine that we can extricate the monster from our midst. We can distance the monster from the pleasure we take in their genius. We can deplatform them from various social media sites. We can revoke their rights to cross our borders, imprison them, institutionalize them. In the process, perhaps convincing ourselves that we have eradicated them from our society, that we have made ourselves safe, protected our futures. But if there's one thing, or seven, that we know about monsters, it's that they always return. Even some of the most extreme individual monsters, Dominique Pellicot, for example, who invited strangers to rape his drugged wife while he filmed them, call attention to the fact that monstrosity is ideological, not individual. As you probably know, over the course of 9 years, 72 men raped Giselle Pellicot 92 times. 51 of those men were identified, that should have come up later. 51 of those men were identified from Dominique's video recordings, tried for the rapes, and convicted. Representing a diversity of ages, races, ethnicities, classes, and work backgrounds, each of the rapists has been referred to as Monsieur Tout le Monde, or Mr. Everyman, an apt moniker that slides easily into Monstre Tout le Monde. In calling attention to the frighteningly quotidian nature of the rapists, Monsieur Monstre Tout le Monde reminds us that the mass rapes of Giselle Pellicot could not happen outside of an ideological system that continues to objectify, devalue, and simply hate women. Thesis 2, monstrosity is fragile. As a technology of fear, monstrosity is a social construct, and like all social constructs, its power depends on its naturalization. If the monster is monstrosity's materialization, then the monster's deconstruction, its denaturalization, destabilizes monstrosity itself. In this context, the rise of the sympathetic monster represents a laying bare of the ideological logics underpinning its once naturalized status. By unmasking the monster, feminist, critical race, queer, and disability monster hunters, to name just a few of the most common, have contributed to the destabilization of white heteropatriarchy's social, cultural, political, and familial hegemonies. In similar fashion, monster studies has revealed and continues to reveal the mechanisms by which monsters are produced, thereby furthering monstrosity's precarity, its fragility, its constant need to reassert its power. If, as I have been suggesting, monstrosity is synonymous with white heteropatriarchal masculinism, then the monster's denaturalization is not the only contributor to monstrosity's precarity. Rather, monstrosity's fragility is entwined with the fragility of masculinity itself. That masculinity is fragile is well established in scholarly disciplines such as gender studies, sociology, psychology, and human-computer interaction. Jonathan A. Allen, in his 2018 article, Masculinity as Cruel Optimism, offers a frank assessment. Quote, simply put, masculinity is fragile, end quote. In their 2020 article, The Political Significance of Fragile Masculinity, Sarah H. DiMuccio and Eric D. Knowles provide a little more context when they note that, quote, in many males, the pressure to earn and prove their manhood triggers anxiety that in turn motivates a variety of compensatory beliefs and behaviors. A man's failure to adhere to masculine expectations is especially threatening because it can lead not only to ostracism or a loss of esteem in the eyes of peers, but to the revocation of his very membership in the high-status man category, end quote. Given the imbricated fragilities of masculinity and monstrosity, repeated threats to the monster's unmasking, to the opening up of white heteropatriarchy's vulnerabilities, activate reactionary instincts to shore up monstrosity's power. And it is precisely this constant covering up of masculinity's fragility in an attempt to signify power that makes monstrosity especially dangerous. Research overwhelmingly indicates strong associations between masculine fragility and misogynist and violent thoughts and actions. For example, men who experience anxiety around their masculinity are more likely to harass women, especially those expressing feminist or egalitarian perspectives. They're more likely to demonstrate aggressive ideation, discomfort, and anger, more likely to have higher pain tolerance, to hit a punching bag harder, to consume more alcohol, to take greater financial risks, and to act more aggressively toward gay men. Additionally, they express greater enthusiasm for guns, and according to studies by Dennis E. Reedy et al., are more likely to perpetuate intimate partner violence and physical assault. And following on this point, thesis 3, monstrosity is violent. Violence, like the monster, is a materialization of monstrosity. Whether discursive or physical, violence inculcates, condenses, disseminates, and perpetuates the fears that help maintain monstrosity's power. It also saturates the manosphere. Here, Andrew Tate's advice, referenced above, to hit and abuse women who don't accept cheating in relationships is utterly typical and oft repeated. Paul Elam, founder of the group A Voice for Men, for instance, created, quote, Bash the Violent Bitch Month in 2010. Fortunately, such a call seems to have been removed from A Voice for Men's website and blog, so I wasn't able to determine whether the month in question was October, which has been widely accepted as Domestic and Intimate Partner Awareness Month by feminists and other allies of women who have been subject to partner abuse. I should say allies of women and others who have been subject to partner abuse. Such discourses of physical violence against women also resonate with equally common discourses of violent sexual entitlement of the grab 'em by the pussy, you can do anything sort. In an effort to avoid further traumatizing and infuriating you, I'm going to forego additional examples of this astoundingly misogynist violence, turning instead to some of the research that makes clear the ways such violence is produced and manifested by the logics of the manosphere. Copland, in his book, The Male Complaint, which I mentioned previously, notes that, quote, policymakers, the media, researchers, and even the broader public have all become increasingly concerned about the manosphere, and for good reason. First is the obvious threat of violence, including incidents of rape, sexual assault, and terror attacks. In addition, leaders such as Andrew Tate have become international superstars who are shaping how many young men think about gender, and not in a healthy way, end quote. While Copland here focuses on the threat of violence circulating in and through the manosphere, elsewhere he acknowledges the continuities between the manosphere's discursive violence and real-world acts of violence it inspires and authorizes. On this point, he writes, quote, the manosphere exists in a nihilistic world, one in which values have lost all relevance, and in which actions like street terrorist attacks are seen, for some, as the only solution to complaint. The manosphere not only does a good job of appealing to men who have such nihilistic sentiments, but the community also promotes these sentiments, making some men feel that violence is a reasonable and a realistic outlet for their complaints, end quote. Debbie Ging, in her frequently cited 2019 article, Alphas, Betas, and Incels, Theorizing Masculinities of the Manosphere, calls attention to a number of cases that attest to Copland's claims. Quote, the manosphere has received considerable media attention, most notably for its extreme misogyny and association with high-profile offline events, from the Isla Vista and Oregon mass shootings and cases of college campus rape, to the sustained abuse and death threats directed at female gamers and journalists that culminated in Gamergate, end quote. Violence is an effective materialization of monstrosity precisely because it is so pervasive, an ever-looming, hovering threat, even as it is often imagined as an individual aberration. Driven by the same logics that push us to see monstrosity as individual as opposed to ideological, it is easy, desirable even, to understand monstrous violence as individual psychological deviance or moral failing. We want to believe that when Elliot Rodger murdered 6 people and wounded 14 others in Isla Vista in 2014, he was simply a mentally ill young man. And to be clear, I believe that Elliot Rodger was just that, a mentally ill young man. I also believe that he was much more than that, a self-identified incel, or involuntary celibate, who frequented numerous manosphere sites. Rodger's manifesto strongly suggests that his murderous rampage is an extension of the manosphere's logic, particularly the ways the manosphere encourages some men to, in Copland's words, quote, feel that violence is a reasonable and a realistic outlet for their complaints. To quote just one brief excerpt from Rodger's manifesto, he writes, I had nothing to live for but revenge. Women must be punished for their crimes of rejecting such a magnificent gentleman as myself. All of those popular boys must be punished for enjoying heavenly lives and having sex with all the girls, while I had to suffer in lonely virginity, end quote. It is not just that Rodger's violence resonates with the violence of the manosphere that indicates its more than individualness. It is also that his violence is upheld and even celebrated. Copland notes that many incels consider him the, quote, patron saint of inceldom. And Ging highlights the fact that many applaud his actions on manosphere boards like the Red Pill, and I can talk about that later if you have questions about what that means, in ways that continue to proliferate monstrosity's power. Thesis 4, monstrosity threatens bodily integrity and self-determination. That monstrosity threatens bodily integrity and self-determination should be abundantly clear from the ways it materializes violence. I present this as a distinct thesis, however, because monstrosity's threats to bodily integrity and self-determination call attention to the specific use of rape and rape discourses as long-standing technologies of fear and demonstrations of power. I was going to make an aside about a paper I heard this morning, but save that so I don't get distracted. In the manosphere, rape and rape discourses are central organizing principles, perhaps best encapsulated most recently in the hashtag, quote, "Your Body, My Choice." Your Body, My Choice was first popularized on election night 2024 by Nick Fuentes, a frighteningly popular 26-year-old streamer, self-identified incel, white nationalist, and Holocaust denier who tweeted, quote, "Your body, my choice forever," end quote. The resonance of his tweet is alarming, although perhaps not surprising, given the way manosphere as monstrosity coheres around rape and rape discourses. Within the first week, Fuentes' tweet had been viewed 90 million times and reposted 35,000 times. According to the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, a think tank for the study of extremism, on the Thursday and Friday following the election, there was a 4,600% increase in mentions of the phrase on the platform X alone. At the same time, beyond X, many women reported that the phrase, which quickly became a manosphere anthem, was overwhelming the comments section of their TikTok video post. Your Body, My Choice quickly spread from the manosphere to the material world. In the week after the election, for instance, one school district sent a message to parents alerting them to the fact that the phrase was being used to taunt and target girls at school, including via chants in classrooms. For a short time, Amazon was selling Your Body, My Choice t-shirts, as were a number of other dad as positive family man websites. You'll see here in the corner, father figure clothing. I know, it's hard to believe it's real. Your Body, My Choice may have been intended as a statement about who should control reproductive decision-making, invoking, as it does, the feminist slogan, My Body, My Choice. The appropriation and reformulation of My Body, My Choice in relation to reproductive autonomy is, of course, problematic in itself and also speaks to the ways that monstrosity threatens bodily integrity and self-determination. Here, I want to maintain the focus on Your Body, My Choice as a rape rallying cry, however, because rape and rape discourses are so foundational to the manosphere. In her extended ethnographic study of professional pickup artists, an industry whose leaders teach men how to seduce women, often relying on the manosphere for maintaining their reputations, disseminating their training videos, and encouraging men to enroll in their programs, Rachel O'Neill shares accounts of rape, which her study participants describe as overcoming the target woman's resistance in order to expose the centrality of coerced, often violent sex to the seduction game. She writes, quote, "Significantly, in each of these stories, which are not isolated examples among my participants, both Stefan and Rahul, and those are pseudonyms, position themselves as licensed to contravene women's stated desires because they know what women really want. Women are positioned as by turns naive or duplicitous, a construction which authorizes men to direct and control all aspects of heterosexual sex, even and especially when women resist their advances," end quote. Copland reiterates the association between pickup artists and rape, pointing out that, quote, "Manosphere men promote rape as a normal activity, at times claiming that this is just part of the seduction game. Seduction artists have even posted videos of them raping women, claiming this to be an indication of their success at game," end quote. To offer one specific example, the well-known pickup artist Rush V, in an article titled "How to Stop Rape," argues, quote, "I thought about this problem and I'm sure I have the solution. Make rape legal if done on private property. I propose that we make the violent taking of women not punishable by law when done off public grounds," end quote. In the logic of the manosphere, such beliefs about women and sex ultimately suggest that there is no such thing as quote-unquote real rape. O'Neill puts it succinctly when she concludes that, quote, "Within this framework of understanding, it is difficult to envision any situation in which a woman's no would legitimately be heard as such," end quote. Rather, according to manosphere men, rape is only ever the product of women's manipulations and false allegations. In an analysis of the sidebar for the Red Pill Reddit, which is widely understood as central to the manosphere, Sophia Persson reads this pervasive refrain and establishes the ideological convergence of red pill ideology and rape mythology, underscoring the point that, quote, conceptualizing women as deceitful is important for rape mythology, and it underpins arguments about false rape allegations. Sidebar ideology and rape mythology think that women make knowingly false allegations against men for personal gain, end quote. In belittling and dismissing rape and rape discourses, the manosphere amplifies their functions as technologies of fear and monstrosity, expanding the threats they pose while simultaneously seeking to deny their realities. Thesis 5 and 5.5, monstrosity is adaptable and shape-shifting, and monstrosity recodes meaning. If the monster always escapes, its escape is facilitated by the fact that monstrosity is adaptable and shape-shifting. Like any dominant system of power, monstrosity appropriates, absorbs, and repurposes that which challenges its hegemony. Along these lines, Cynthia Enlow writes of patriarchy, in particular, that it, quote, has an immense adaptive capacity, co-opting challenges to its dominance and thereby stabilizing its power, end quote. And Henri Mertenen, in his work on new masculinities, observes that, quote, although it has come under multiple attacks and pressures over the past decades, patriarchy has proven itself to be highly resilient and adaptive, end quote. Hegemonic incorporation and reappropriation often work by recoding signifiers that represent potential challenges, as when white heteropatriarchy takes up and resituates Black urban or gay men's cultural markers. Dimitrakis Z. Detrio offers an example of how the mainstream assimilation of, quote, fragments of gay culture, end quote, become a, quote, strategy for the legitimation and reproduction of patriarchy, end quote, in his critique of Robert W. Connell's foundational 1993 sociological theory of hegemonic masculinity. Drawing on Antonio Gramsci's concept of the historical bloc and Homi Bhabha's understanding of hybridization, Detrio's analysis focuses on the mechanisms of adaptation that reproduce and sustain hegemonic power. He writes, quote, to say that the dominant form of masculinity is a hybrid bloc that continually reconfigures itself through hybridization is not simply to say that hegemony is a, quote, historically mobile relation. It is rather to stress that the hegemonic bloc changes in a very deceptive, his emphasis, and unrecognizable way. It changes through negotiation, appropriation, and translation, through the transformation of what appears counter-hegemonic and progressive into an instrument of backwardness and patriarchal reproduction, end quote. Detrio's point that hegemonic masculinity transforms challenges to its supremacy into, quote, instruments of backwardness and patriarchal reproduction undergirds thesis 5.5, monstrosity recodes meaning. I grant this claim half-thesis status in order to distinguish the appropriation and reframing of counter-hegemonic cultural signifiers from more elaborate forms of reorienting counter-hegemonic logics that seek to defy monstrosity's authority and contest the foundations of its naturalized power. As an example, I offer the foundational seduction industry and manosphere concept of last-minute resistance, or LMR as it's widely known. LMR refers to the purportedly token objections that women make prior to having sex, and the seduction industry and manosphere devote a great deal of time to discussing methods for overcoming LMR. LMR's underlying precepts are anchored in what sound like common feminist claims. Specifically, women enjoy sex and are generally culturally shamed for that, especially if they have casual sex, sex outside of monogamous relationships, and or sex with multiple partners. Pickup artists and manosphere influencers often decry the sexual double standard implicit in such attitudes about female sexuality, precisely because doing so allows them to recode such feminist critiques to mean that a woman's objections to sex are nothing more than perfunctory attempts to avoid being perceived as a slut. According to the logic of pickup artists in the manosphere, women only ever perform resistance for the sake of their reputations. According to one pickup artist trainer then, men first need to understand that because women police themselves to avoid being called sluts, their no's never really mean no. Given that, men simply need to learn the methods for successfully pushing beyond women's performative resistance. As Rachel O'Neill makes clear in her ethnography of pickup artists, quote, by insisting that women's verbal communication is not simply ambiguous but deceptive and misleading, LMR licenses men to disregard what women say and to do so in the earnest belief that they are in fact fulfilling women's unspoken and unspeakable desires. The concept of LMR thus remains firmly within the terms of the double sexual standard from which it initially appears to seek distance, because it is always already assumed that women are unable to express their desire for sex. There is little room within this formulation for women to legitimately refuse sex, end quote. In another, perhaps more idiosyncratic example, one participant in a seduction training program expressed his discomfort with the tactics he was being taught. He confesses that, quote, the more I learn about PUA theory, the more it lowers my respect for people, end quote. Okay, his sentiment probably resonates for many of us. But then he continues, quote, specifically women, because it's terrible, that's what guys have to do, end quote. Here, this participant recodes the demeaning, violent, and often non-consensual methods that pickup artists have created in order to blame women for their ostensible effectiveness and thus necessity of such practices. Again, while perhaps idiosyncratic, this recoding nonetheless highlights how the seduction community's misogyny gives new meaning to implicit feminist critiques. With this conjectural theory of monstrosity in mind, I want to return to the question and possibility that I raised earlier about how hope and fear might be oriented together, to use Susan McManus's words, in order to inspire possibilities for what she calls a gentle capacity. As you may recall, McManus suggests, quote, turning the technologies that are central to the production of fear against themselves as one possibility for, quote, intervening in the feedback loops through which fear is stabilized. What might that involve in relation to monstrosity's technologies of fear? This is an open question, not a rhetorical one, nor one that I have an entirely satisfying answer for yet. I do, however, have two examples that might be productive for starting to think through this question. The first involves a 2013 rape case involving two seduction trainers and one of their students. The trainers, Alex Smith and Jonas Dick, worked for a company called Efficient Pickup. Jason Berlin was their student. Per their arrangement, Berlin rented an apartment where the two trainers lived and where he would join them on the weekend for his lessons. The following summary of what occurred on the night in question is from O'Neill's book, Seduction. Quote, Smith and Dick went to a nearby club and later brought two women back to the apartment. While Dick distracted one woman in the living room, Smith and Berlin took it in turns to rape the other woman in the bedroom. She was rendered unconscious and vomited repeatedly during the assault, end quote. The woman immediately reported the rape and underwent a forensic examination, but the police were slow to investigate. Frustrated that the police weren't doing more, the woman began researching the men online and discovered their connection to the seduction industry. As she read through a forum where the trainers regularly posted about their successes, she discovered that Smith had posted a description of her rape. This is the description. It's a little bit graphic. I apologize. Jonas and I are both teaching BC boot camp tonight. We run into each other at pool o'clock, bar closing time. He asks me to wing for him. I do. Within a couple of minutes, I'm fingering my girl right outside of the bar in public. Pull back to the spot, 0 LMR, make her beg for my dick, and I say, only if my friend can fuck you too. So we run a train on the hoe. I text Jonas to choo-choo her, but he has to occupy her friend. Her friend came out and I was like, yeah, we just tag team your friend. My chick freaked out because now she's a slut, etc. I get hit in the face with a high heel. I laugh. We kick them out. Here, the woman disrupts one of monstrosity's primary mechanisms of fear, the heralding of rape as proof of the pickup artist's success at game, by transforming it into legal evidence, which in turn played a considerable role in securing convictions against the 3 rapists, as well as an additional charge and conviction for Dick, whose DNA was matched to an unsolved case involving the forcible rape of a 16-year-old girl. The second example also involves the way rape culture is documented, celebrated, and memorialized in the manosphere as part of the mechanism by which fear sustains monstrosity. In this example, a group of anonymous artists calling themselves the Secret Handshake gave material form to the manosphere's memorialization of rape culture when they created and installed the statue Best Friends Forever, later retitled Why Can't We Be Friends, on the National Mall in the shadow of the Capitol building. The ironic levity of the statue, depicting 2 convicted rapists, Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein, in gleeful camaraderie, calls attention to, among other things, a certain joy implicit in the manosphere's perceived entitlements. In my reading of the statue as a possible intervention into one of monstrosity's technologies of fear, Why Can't We Be Friends momentarily disrupts the constant vigilance rape culture necessitates, suggesting instead, again, even if only temporarily, that it is convicted rapists who ought to be on guard because they're the ones under surveillance and at risk of exposure and public humiliation. To conclude then, if, as McManus suggests, political change depends on agential capacity, and if agential capacity might result from an imagining of fear affects together with hope affects, then I think it's time we do more than celebrate the monsters we've come to love. Now, more than ever, we must join forces with our monsters to disrupt the technologies that monstrosity employs to harm and oppress us all. Thank you. I'm very happy to take questions, but before I do, I just want to tell one really quick anecdote. So I do work at Soledad Correctional Facility, and one of the things I do is I participate in a book group there, and we always start the book group with a check-in, and I was there about maybe four or 5 weeks ago, and I was reading a lot of this material. I hadn't started writing the talk yet. I was really having a lot of resistance to writing this talk, and my check-in was to say, I'm reading all of this stuff about the manosphere, and it's really getting to me, and so I have a lot of joy being with all of you here tonight because this is a group of men who have done tremendous work thinking about masculinity. And last week when I was there, one of the men who is a spoken word artist and poet, during his check-in said, Kim, I wrote a poem for you. It's called Man So Fear. And I don't have time to read it, but I believe this QR code should link to a PDF of this poem. And it's a great, it's just a great analysis of fragile masculinity and what he calls bravado, and I just love it. And this to me was like one of the greatest gifts I've ever received, so I wanted to share it with you, and I feel like it was really appropriate because I am a feminist killjoy. I totally own that, but I also do find a lot of hope in some men. That's the best I can do.
I think that's a great place to start questions.
If that QR code doesn't work, let me, oh, it works? Okay, awesome.
Hey, first of all, that was an amazing talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
But it feels like this like manosphere is really tied to the commoditization of sex and its separation from like love and communication. Do you have any advice on how we can like rejoin those things without, causing more suffering?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And Rachel O'Neill's book is really, really good because she also brings a Marxist labor perspective to the seduction industry and talks about how exactly what you said, how all their discourses are rooted in labor, so that men are learning these strategies. And she's even interviewed a ton of men who say things like, I don't even want to have sex with women, but I have to keep doing this because I'm now trained to do this. I have to keep my training up, right? Unfortunately, she nor I really have a solution for how to introduce like love and sex without an overly romanticized kind of understanding of what's entailed in sex that undermines a lot of what feminism has worked toward as well. So I think it's a great question, and I think it's one that we all need to think about together, and I would love to have people think about that. I would love someone to figure that out and then email me directly as soon as you have figured that out and let me know, because it might give me a little bit more hope. But yeah, thanks.
Hi, Kim. Thank you for the wonderful talk. I'm just curious if you have made any or have any thoughts or made any connections between the phenomenon of young men now not pursuing any higher education and the manosphere, because I know I teach, and I've seen over maybe the last 20 years the number of young men, college-age young men not going to college is really dramatic, at least where I'm teaching. So I'm just curious about that.
I haven't thought about that explicitly. I have seen some of those data points. There is a lot of concern. I mean, okay, I guess I might be totally stereotyping here, but I think that I'm sure that on college campuses we find manosphere participants. I would speculate that among the group that doesn't go to college, there might be a high percentage of manosphere participants, right? So there is a lot of work and worry about how compelling the manosphere is for especially young men who are just beginning to think about masculinity. So middle school age especially. So I've read some things about middle school teachers who are like, what do we even do? Because it's so pervasive. And as that one study showed, men often, or boys often get sucked into this by researching on gaming or gym tips, or right, all the things that they're really vulnerable to at those ages. And so I haven't looked at the education angle, but I think it's a good and compelling one, and I do know that educators are trying to think about that as well.
If in your reading of the manosphere, and thank you for reading that so I don't have to, I'm just wondering, I would assume there's an anti-intellectual bent to it.
Yes, not explicitly, but I mean, so I had heard about these things a little bit, and I was like, I don't need to worry about that because that's like some lunatic fringe. That's just like, it's laughable. But then when I started reading the articles and saw how extensive it was, it really freaked me out. So I think just the claims that they make are themselves like anti-intellectual, and I mean, they're like absurd, really. I'm probably like, hopefully someone's not going to tweet out that I just said that because I'll get harassed for the rest of my life. But they don't make sense. They're totally cockamamie. But the male complaint is often legitimate because it's rooted in like class oppression and all these other phenomena, globalization, all these other things that have happened to change men's lives. But in the manosphere, all the things that have happened to change their lives are ascribed to women and to feminism. Yeah. I mean, there are legitimate concerns for complaint, I guess is what I'm saying. And then the anti-intellectual part in my reading is the perception of what's happening to them, or the explanation of what's happening to them. Yeah. Austin. I think you need a microphone, though, because they're recording.
Thank.
Oh, is it somebody?
Yeah.
Okay, I see.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. It was really chilling, but really important. As a kind of maybe a little bit chronically online Black woman, it's hard for me not to run directly into at least the Black manosphere. Like, we kind of have our own version of it that's linked, but that's also different. And I'm wondering if in your research for this project, you're sort of engaging, I think a lot of valuable insights and analysis of this is actually coming from content creators who are critiquing it. And also like coming up with their own strategies too for like, do we ignore it? Do we engage it? Like they're kind of living out loud the fight with this stuff. So I was just wondering if, like I didn't really know there was a body of academic work on this, so I'm excited to engage it because I'm considering a project around the manosphere and Black romance. But I'm wondering if if engaging some of the content creators who are also kind of trying to fight back or kind of playing with their own strategies of how to deal with it. Because it's like, do you introduce this to more people by critiquing it? Do you put yourself in spaces with them? Like there is a popular Black academic, I don't know, from Mark Lamont Hill, who's actually like going on these podcasts or whatever, debating with these guys, like presenting his perspectives as a cis hetero, masculine presenting Black man to be able to sort of combat this directly. So I was just kind of wondering, like, in stepping into this digital space, if that was something you'd considered or come across any of that kind of work, the work that content creators are doing in this area.
I didn't research very much of that, but I came across a couple articles, and there was one really good one. They weren't necessarily content creators of the type you're talking about, but there were these two women in Edmonton who were targeted specifically because they were leaders of an organization that ran an anti-sexual assault campaign, and then they got doxxed, and so they used a lot of tactics, and so the article was about that, and I thought it was quite good. I really was here trying to think about this kind of masculinism of this moment, and specifically white, because it dovetails and converges so often with white nationalism and extreme racism. And historically, that has been, the power structure, and I would say still is. So I was really trying to, at first I was just thinking, okay, the manosphere is really scary. That's our moments. That's the monstrosity of the moment. But as I started to think about it more, I really think they're synonymous. And then, so I was going to just mention Asa Mittman's, I was at his paper this morning and showed a reliquary, or, a coffin, casket, small casket. But I showed also images of sleep coming to, was that not your paper? Yeah, it was. To put, what's her name? Ariadne to sleep. Thank you. Rhea Silvia to sleep so that Mars could come rape her, basically, right? So it just, rape culture is huge right now, but it's our legacy. It's so as I started to think about white heteropatriarchal masculinism, I wasn't just thinking about this moment. I know it sounds outrageous that I would say this, but I think monstrosity is synonymous with that. And historically, we could possibly see these 5.5 theses playing out in different historical moments in similar ways, right? So I also was thinking about the witch hunts and things like that. But we have just such a long culture of it. So I guess in some ways, that's why I didn't look at content creators. That's why I didn't look at resistance in that way. That's why I was really trying to think about, this is monstrosity. It's expressed in our moment right now in the way that we understand. It's what's legible to us, but it is the same thing. This, Cohen's theses, it's just changing over time, and that's what we see as monstrosity. So, yeah, I think you got my point. Sorry.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm not going to sleep anymore. But one of the things I was wondering about is, you talked about the kind of absurdity of the arguments that are made. And I've spent a long time now researching anti-Semitism. One of the things that always really stands out to me is these weird, obvious contradictions. So Jews are, according to anti-Semites, inherently inferior, weak, lowly creatures, and yet control the entire world. And there's a I was seeing a similar structure in a lot of what you were talking about. So men are, brilliant and strong and wonderful, but also abjectly prey to women who are apparently, both naive but duplicitous, easy prey and yet totally all-powerful. And so I'm wondering if part of the kind of absurdity at the core of it is that, because it's founded on absolute nonsense, that this inherent sort of internal contradictions, they seem really fundamental to this working.
Yeah, yes, I feel like that could be another thesis about monstrosity, right? Because that's also like the underlying, or one of the underlying precepts of Orientalism, too. Like anytime we have this kind of othering, which is monster making, right? I don't think I'm going too far in saying that. There's other kinds of othering, but monster making is often about othering. And then I think that in all those cases, we see that contradiction. I guess it's just something about the technology. I love this, technologies of monstrosity image, because when I used to teach that vampire class that Renee was talking about, I would talk to the students, I'm like, just put in whatever's happening in the moment and crank the machine and out comes your particular monster. And so I do think that that's a great additional thesis about there is, I guess we could maybe consider it under this idea of how adaptable and shape-shifting it is, right? Because it can accommodate both the need for a dominant threat, but it can also accommodate the need to, disparage someone because they're weak, right? So it has, that machine has to be able to accommodate all those different things, I guess, maybe. Yeah, thanks for that, though. I think that's a really good point.
Sure, thank you.
I almost hesitated to ask this question, Kim, because it's similar to a question that came before, talking about asking for resources, interventions, right? But I'm going to ask it anyway with an example. I had a young man in a poetry class that I was teaching here at UCSC who asked me to help him conceptualize creating an online safe space for white male poets. And it was a challenge for me because there was this way in which he was using this language, these signifiers from feminist thinking, like safer space or safe space. And it was very clear to me that he was bumping up against the manosphere, right? And so I guess I'm curious, and perhaps this is a question for all of us, is any sort of interventions. Like the way that I approached it is I spent a lot of time with him. I introduced him to the Vita count. I spent a lot of time with him. He was a reader, an avid reader. So introducing him to feminist texts. And also I encouraged him to talk to his girlfriend about her experiences in classes of what a safer space might have looked like for her. But I'm just wondering if there's any particular texts or resources for these young people that are coming into our classes now that are bumping up against the manosphere and are understanding some of it as fact because they're reading it in news articles, they're reading it, right? Any interventions or resources that we can direct them to say, hey, there's these alternative ways of thinking about this.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Right? In these ways that feel so obvious to me of my generation.
Yes, and yes. I don't know what all those resources are, but I know my colleague Meg Kahn, who works at the CARE office on campus, which is our confidential resources for survivors of sexual assault in particular, other kind of partner violence and things like that. She was at Soledad with me last week when Sam presented this poem, and so she heard a little bit of context about what I was working on, and she reached out to me because there is a national network of programs for healthy masculine futures to help bring men, college men, into leadership around talking about healthy masculine futures and what that means. And so she was asking me, did I want to collaborate? And she's trying to bring people together across campus. So that's one thing I know about. I could find the name of the exact group that she's working with. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I can look for that. And I think there are probably many other resources. Like, I do think a lot of people are trying to work on this problem, because as that New York Times op-ed piece, just came out, like, we ignore this at our peril. And I did for so long, because I was just like, that's a bunch of wackadoodles. Like, I don't, and there's probably 10 of them. Like, I don't need to worry about that. And then when I started to see the numbers, I got so freaked out. And so, but a lot of people have been watching this for a long time. And so I think there are resources, and it just wasn't like part of this project, because I was really trying to think about, like, how do we recuperate fear? Like, fear seems like it's an important part of monstrosity, not only for the people cranking out the monsters who want to stay in power, but as McManus is saying, how we can reorient fear in relation to hope for some kind of possible transformative agency, so that we're not just hanging on this kind of hope that is also often reactionary and conservative. It can be. So I was really looking at fear and hope more than, like, how do we solve this problem. But I think other people are really looking at how to solve the problem. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Lau, for your
I can't see where you
presentation.
are. Oh, I see. Thank you.
On that note, I heard you talk about shame when you spoke about is it the LMR, or how this sort of, like, in the manosphere, appropriating the language surrounding shame and women's experience of shame relating to sex, how that now is being reframed as, like, a tactic for the pickup artists. And how do you see shame interacting with fear in your work? And is there, if we're trying to, like, suture fear and hope together, what is something like hope that we can combine with shame and sort of not lose it completely, but experience it in a way that's productive in our writing and feeling, as, like, a sort of antidote, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I feel like queer theory's really been at the forefront of that question about how to recuperate fear, or how to think about fear shame very powerfully, theoretically. Catherine Stockton's work, she was one of my colleagues when I taught at Utah, so her work comes to mind. Maybe Jose Esteban and Lisa Duggan, I think. They have a great conversation about, between the two of them, about hope and utopia. And, Duggan is like, no hope, no utopia, no future. And Esteban was, when he was alive, like, wanted to make space for queer utopia and the possibility of hope. So they were good friends and colleagues. So there's a conversation between them that's published. But yeah, and those are just a couple that come to mind. I think probably, what's his name now? Who wrote No Future, or, yes, thank you. Edelman's probably in there, and maybe Lauren Berlant in the book that she did with Edelman. But yeah, I think there's really good queer theory, I would say, at the forefront. Possibly other people have done that work too, but I think of the queer theorists as the ones really on the vanguard of that. Yeah.
Just, you know, on the hope side, I just want to say, like, I'm in my late 50s, and, you know, there has, you know, I think the manosphere is horrifying, but on the flip side of that, you know, there has been a huge rise in consent and conversations around consent, and, you know, women having agency. And just at an earlier lecture, someone was talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you know, making it legal for women to have credit cards without men. So, I mean, it's not just like, I always think about 16 Candles, which was like a beloved movie for me when I was young, and I rewatched it thinking I'd show it to my kids and was horrified at like the date rape. It's so awful. And you know what I mean? Just like that perspective has really changed for women of my generation. And I think like when I talk, my daughter's here, and when we have conversations around consent or listening to things about sexual agency, it's really changed. What many women believe in this generation and what men understand, and what wasn't even a conversation when I was young.
I think that's true in many ways, and I'm your same age, and so yes, that's absolutely true. And I think the manosphere discourses are a backlash to that kind of discourse, right? To positive consent, to having to have consent trainings. I mean, just this week, all that stuff that came out about the young Republicans on those text chains, I mean, those were not so much about sex, but it's that same kind of reactionary pushback against being told by these, you know, woke people like us, I suppose. And yeah, so absolutely, we have much better laws, like rape within marriage, et cetera. We've come a long way. See, now I feel like that Virginia Slims ad, like for women smoking cigarettes, which most of you are probably too young to remember. Yes, and so I think that much of this is really pushback against those ideas. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for giving this talk. I'm wondering if any of your research into the manosphere, or their leaders specifically, showed you how when they were trying to build their like sort of gilded cage of masculinity, it sort of gave off the idea that they were more afraid of being like sort of seen as like homosexuals. The reason for my question is because in a lot of public forums, it has been stated that a lot of Republican gatherings, Grindr generally crashes. And that doesn't really happen unless there's a lot of users at once. Anyone in CS can tell you that.
I think that's a great question. I mean, the distinction between homosexuality and the threat of homosexuality or accusations of homosexuality is like a long-standing one in Western culture. And the Copland book that I cited, it's called The Male Complaint, which he uses ironically. He talks a lot about how men often gravitate to these sites for that homosociality. And I don't want to overgeneralize, but oftentimes in highly homosocial contexts, there is also a need to assert heterosexuality if homosexuality is seen as a negative thing, right? And so for me, that's all wrapped up with how fragile masculinity is and how much it needs to be shored up all the time and that sort of work. So yes, I would say that what we see in the influencers is like a hyper hetero masculinity. And it's, for me, I'm always talking about white heteropatriarchal masculinism, so the hetero part is really important. It is really about sexual conquest and subjugation of women in particular. I'm not just kind of forgetting that there are men who are not heterosexual. It's part of that dominant ideology, I would say. So yeah, so they're, as you called it, gilded cage, which is be nice to think of them as like kind of contained that way. That yes, I think it is a lot about propping up heterosexuality, and often that is a cover for fragility, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for this talk. It's very unnerving.
Thank you.
I was thinking of a moment. I think it's in Colin Dickey's, one of his books he wrote, but he talks about the different kind of monsters that we sometimes imagine to populate the internet and our different technologies. So obviously there's like trolling, and there's obviously ghosting. But like one he had introduced it was that I hadn't heard of was like mermaiding, like the idea of when someone emerges into like say a dating app, then momentarily disappears, sort of luring you siren-like in. And it makes me think of how those monsterizing technologies are sort of othering in a shaming way, sort of modes of non-response or non-interest. And so I was just thinking a little bit about I don't know what that iconography of monsters is. I don't know, it's really lovely to see the language people are creating through monsters to shame in certain kind of ways, and I think the mermaiding one, I think that's different. That one feels wrong to me.
You have to ask Delandra about that.
Yeah. So I'm curious if there's any vocabularies of monsters in that kind of way that are emerging to sort of name and shame these sorts of responses.
I would imagine that outside of the manosphere, and there are boards for people who are like recovering incels or recovering from the red pill and things like that. So there are some men who have created sites, and I didn't look at those at all, so I don't know. But maybe, I wouldn't be surprised if just a very generic label of monster got applied to them, like to incels in particular, right? Because they're so noted for their acts of violence against women in particular, but often have bystanders involved too. Within the manosphere, women are, I don't know, maybe there's not language specifically. I can't think of anything specifically like monster-esque language, but they are characterized in the same kinds of traits that monsters have, right? So one of the groups that I mentioned that's very active is this men's rights groups, which sounds totally banal, and these are people who really believe that, women have manipulated society and laws and politics to have all the rights, especially in relation to children and fathers, so taking rights away from fathers. And so there, the language is, not kind or generous in any way about women, but I can't think of specific kinds of monsters that are being invoked there. Yeah, thanks.
All right, last question.
All right, this is kind of tough, but I've just been thinking about how many of the theses had the word violence in it, or just the idea of violence, which is, I guess, what rape is. But as I was thinking about this, I guess I was thinking of the rapist who posted, and I don't know how reliable this is, that one of the women hit him on the head with a shoe, right? And I thought, what if that shoe had been a gun? And when I first came to the conference, I'm sorry, Renee, I'm going up to your earrings that first night. They were little battle axes, right? And he said, sometimes we have to carry our own weapons. And I've just been thinking about, I guess, violence and fear. And it seems like there are spaces using the forms against them in the legal capacity, finding alternative forms, healing from this kind of toxic masculinity, for lack of a better term. But is violence something, or defense something that maybe we need to think about more seriously?
Yeah, I think Rachel O'Neill has a really great question, because I was trying to think of other examples of where there's like possible breaks in the feedback loop or disruptions in the feedback loop of fear. And I was thinking, well, women do learn about these pickup artist tactics, and they write about them and make pamphlets and distribute them, like especially in bars and things like that. And I was thinking that that seems like an example, and I do think it could be an example. But then Rachel O'Neill in her book was making the point that if we do that, if we think of that as like a solution, it's putting the onus on women to not be victimized, right? So which is important, and I think defense is important too. So it's part of this like bigger question about structure and productions of fear, technologies of fear, and what resistance looks like, and what the implicit messages are that we're giving when we protect ourselves, right? So I wouldn't say like, let's not protect ourselves, let's not let other women know like what these things are like, but I don't know if that's a way to talk about it as a solution, which I realize is not what you were saying. You're just saying, do we need to think about these things? But yeah, so I thought that was an important point that she was making there, that we don't want to reproduce the structure that we're in, even if it's we don't want to reproduce the structure by talking about it in that way. Of course, she's not like, oh, don't make those pamphlets, don't let other people know. Like, that's still important work. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. Her book is really great, by the way, I would say. It's called Seduction. Yeah.
So we will reconvene for our next panel at 3:15. Let's thank Kim for this fantastic, terrifying talk.